our hands. We had an old legacy platform that looked like this. It was one single repository, a single code base, a big Django application, and the system had grown quite hard to maintain. We wanted to develop new features. We had a larger team. We had problems with rendering time of pages. We had a lot of problems with build times or eternal builds. So we wanted to break the system into smaller services. This is kind of what we had in mind. This is simplified view for the purpose of the presentation of what we were planning to do. So we had we were decoupling the UI from the actual backend. The actual backend was to be an API-based service, and the UI was to be developed in AngularJS. And basically, we are also breaking down the base backend system into 3 different applications. And then what we had is we had a team of front-end people and back-end people. Front-end people working on JavaScript. They were complaining all the time because it was the starting phase of the project. Things were moving very quickly. Back-end people would make breaking changes to the API. Everything was broken. Everyone was crying. So basically, this was the structure. It was just a UI talking to the backend by an HTTP API. And what we wanted to make sure is that there was no friction between the teams, that both teams also were able to, since things were moving quickly and sometimes the front-enders would be ahead of the back-enders and so on, we want to prevent blockings between the 2 teams, and we want to be able to, we want the teams to be able to work together a bit better. And also we wanted, and this was important, that people could test their bits separately. So the front-end people would be able to test their things even before the backend was ready. And also, what was happening is that the backend team was at some point, as they were publishing API changes, they were the ones dictating how the API looked, and the API was not always convenient for the front-end client. So we came up is we need to have a way to discuss and decide on the API before moving on. So we created a format to specify the API. This format, we call it the API by example, where an API is described with examples. So instead of having some sort of formal language defined API, what we wanted is just make sample request responses that we could use as fixtures for our testing as well. So we define this format is based on JSON files, and we call this the API by example, API format. This is kind of what it looks like. You have a header section where we describe what this endpoint. So we had one file for every endpoint and method combination. Had one file where basically describe this is your endpoint. There's a description because later on we wanted to also build tools to generate documentation out of this sample. And there's kind of this is kind of the general specification. And these are, here you had examples, and within each examples you could have various labels, whatever labels you chose, and each label was used to describe an example. For example, you would have one case where there's an actual response from the system. You could have a case where you have, for example, you have no access permissions. We also wanted to make sure that, because typically we design the APIs for the good response cases, but sometimes when things break, then from the front end you cannot retrieve the response because suddenly the response is not encapsulated in any agreed format. So we want also things like 404s and 403s and this kind of responses to be specified with example responses, so that the front enders can process them and actually display these responses. So this is the structure of the repos that we came up with. To begin with, this is a simpler version even of the beginning version, but what we'll have is the backend and the UI would feed from the mocks. This is what we called our collection of ABE samples. So to simplify, we were starting with this kind of structure, 3 repositories. And the process, it always started with a PR, a pull request, to the mocks repository. So if there's a need for a new endpoint, what we did is somebody started drafting this endpoint, created an ABE file, and made a pull request to the mocks repo with this new file. And then there was a discussion between someone, at least we wanted someone from front end and someone from back end to be involved in the discussions to make sure that the API was fulfilling the needs of both. Also interestingly, this pull request became a documented discussion over the pros and cons of different approaches to the API. So it became kind of a documented, not spec, but a kind of a documented history of why we came out with something. And so whenever a PR was deemed this is good, it was merged. And then this represents that we have a new API release, which basically is a new commit hash in the MOX 2.1. Once we have a new API release, then the front-end and the back-end people are able to work on their own sections. They have to change the dependency of the MOX, the version of the MOX that they depend on. And so we made this MOX repo easily installable in both cases, so you could pip install it with Python, and you could also power install it for the UI people. So basically what happened is basically when something got merged, and we have a new version of the API, then we could start with a new PR to the front end and the back end with the updated version. And then we could even send this PR and make it run through CI. And sometimes the changes in the the changes in the API are just backwards compatible. Everything still works. So if everything still works and you don't need to do changes in code, that can just be merged. But sometimes, most often, it's just an enhancement. You need to write specific tests for that. So basically, but this was the starting point, the new branch with this new version, a starting point for people to work on the new functionality. So we did this also this was the process, and then to support this process we created some tools. So the basic idea to define this format and not just document with the specification was because we wanted to make sure that we could build tooling around this. So that's why we chose the JSON format, something that's easily processed by tools, but it's also easily read by geeks. I was going to say humans, but easily read by geeks at least. So AV Protector is a tool that the front-end people built. Is anyone familiar with Protector? Protector is a Node.js-based tool that is using the WebDriver, Selenium WebDriver API to talk to Selenium. So it's basically a way to run browser-based tests. And in Protractor you can mock backend or HTTP responses. So basically we built this tool that allowed the front-end people to actually have a setup where they could run their whole series of tests without a working backend, but just with a mock backend based on the API's AV samples. We built a library, AV Python, which we used on the Python side of things, and this gives you just a very simplistic way to load these files and into Python objects. And also we added some mixing utilities so that you can use it in your tests. So this is kind of the full setup if you run it. So the UI would talk to when running the test, it would talk to a mock backend that was using a AV Protractor to load mocks from the mocks directory. And on the backend it was similar. So in the backend you had the API test fed from the mocks. And it was, in this case, the responsibility of the backend people to create factories to generate their test data so that the test data here match the mocks, the expectation of the mocks. So for example, if there's an API and you need to retrieve a couple of objects, then they make sure that they have factories to create these objects for the test. And here's how it looks on the Python side. I don't have samples for the JavaScript, but I guess you're more interested in the Python side anyway. So this kind of how it looks. You have your test case. In this case, we're using a Django REST framework. So you extend test case with this mixin. Configuration for this mixin is you have to give it a root directory of where it's going to load the samples from. And then the only thing you need to do in your test case is you have your preparation of the test case. You remember from last meetup I talked preparation, space, exercise the code, space, and check. So, and the only thing you need to do in the check basically is check that the response to the URL you send matches the sample that is in this sample file with this label. So basically it makes your testing very, very simple because you only have to set conditions, make a request. I think the only thing that's missing now that we are not checking is actually the method that you're using is the same. But basically, this is it. So this is just of it. So it kind of ends up, the process ends up being, it makes it very easy to write tests in the sense that this takes care of all your value verification. It's all in a format that can be used by tools. Later on, you could use this format to do other kind of tools. And there's still a work in progress. And for example, one thing I would be very interested in hearing if any of you have this kind of same problem where they need to go through this kind of process of API, test an API, test the front end, make things consistent. And there are some tools we still want to build based on that, and one is precisely a tool to generate documentation automatically, because it would be really nice now that this sample structure, it would be relatively easy to generate markdown documents and just render these to some browsable HTML documentation of your API. And this is it, so just talk to me or to me. Thank you. Have any questions?
There are many tools that already do that. Why did you create one? For example, there's API blueprints or RAML, for example. So why did you choose to create a new one?
We chose to create one because we are not aware specifically. We did this in something like 1 year ago. I was not aware of many tools at that point, or they were very specific. On the Python world, you had several things you could use to mock API backend, and on the JavaScript as well. But something that tied both things together and allowed you to draw things, we didn't know this. But did you use any of these?
Yeah, more or less. It's better what you have is a little bit better than what we're using. So
no, but give me a link of what.
Yeah, sure. Later I will leave you a link.
So we're going to our next speaker.